In this lecture, we look at the sociology of education. By way of an introduction, we put forward the idea that education is a social institution. In other words, it's part of a larger context, and it's a product of its times. We also need to bear in mind that schools are formal institutions. In other words, bureaucratic structures that have stated goals but are also subject to other pressures as well. We also acknowledge that there are fundamentally different views of education within the field of sociology. Here we focus on those views and the stakes that are implied with each. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on two different theoretical frameworks, that being functionalism and conflict theory views of education. First, functionalism. And remember that for functionalists, the key thing about any social institution is how it contributes to the social consensus. In other words, the question that they always ask of any institution is this: what are its functions? What roles does it fulfill in society? I've used the phrase learning to labor here to offer a top-line summary of the functionalist assumptions about education, meaning that the overall role of education is to prepare students to play a productive part in the economy. What do they point to specifically? First, that schools teach students values that encourage cultural conformity, such as respect for the rule of law. Second, that schools teach and enforce common standards, and what we mean by that is common standards for how one speaks and common standards for how one writes. Third, schools play a part in promoting identification with the nation. This is what political scientist Benedict Anderson referred to as an imagined community. Because the sense of connection with a nation, let's say our sense of connection with being Canadian, is a very abstract thing and must be taught. Finally, functionalists believe that the education system helps students find their appropriate place in the labor force by sorting them into different streams for post-secondary education. What are the main assumptions underlying the functionalist view of education? First, that differences in educational outcomes are the result of individual achievement only and not other factors. Second, that testing in schools, in particular IQ testing, is a valid way of revealing a student's intellectual capacity. Third, the assumption that schools provide all students with equal opportunities to succeed. And fourth, that the competitive aspects of the education system, and we can look at the competition for better grades, for instance, these aspects are overall demonstrations of meritocracy. And we remember that meritocracy means that people who work harder will be rewarded more. Here we have a visual representation of meritocracy. You know, the idea that higher degrees of success involve harder work by the individual. You can see that the student on the left is closer to success than the student on the right who has not worked as hard. Conflict theorists are quite opposed to the notion that the educational system benefits everyone equally. Generally speaking, conflict theorists insist that you have to look at educational success within the wider context of social inequality. For one thing, the financial burden of post-secondary education hits families harder the further they are down the income scale, something we'll come back to in a moment. Another issue for conflict theorists concerns assessments such as IQ tests. The evidence is clear by now that students from underprivileged backgrounds don't do as well on IQ tests, not because they aren't as smart, but because the typical questions are based on how proficient you are within a cultural system. But more of that in this week's module reading. Yet another reason why schooling is stacked against the disadvantaged is the role of cultural capital. One way or another, teacher evaluations of student performance involve how well they have internalized shared cultural standards. And a student coming from a family with a lot of cultural capital, let's say the mother and father are both professors or lawyers or other highly educated people, those students will find it much easier to meet the standards expected in school than a student who comes to the classroom with less in hand. The best way we can sum up the conflict theory perspective on education is actually to quote directly from page 450 in our textbook. And I'm quoting here, based on the evidence, they believe that the benefits of education are unequally distributed and lead to the reproduction of the existing stratification system. Here's a look at one of the impacts of social class on education. This chart looks at post-secondary attainment in terms of the parents' level of education. And here's another look. This one is looking at the correlation between your parents' income and your own post-secondary education. The higher the income of the parents, the greater the likelihood that you will attend either college or university. Thank you.